The alien prison was hidden deep inside a barren moon, a place no one visited and no one cared to remember. But inside its walls was a secret that could shake the stars themselves. The corridors were dim and cold, filled with the metallic smell of rust and strange alien fluids, and the guards walked without concern, believing their duty was nothing more than routine. Behind heavy bars, in cages too small for comfort, sat a group of children, but these were not alien children. They were human. Their small eyes glowed with fear, and their hands clutched the cold iron bars as they whispered quietly to one another. Some of them cried, their voices echoing like broken music against the walls, yet the guards only smirked, treating it as nothing more than another job. To them, children were children, weak and unimportant, but one alien officer, older than the rest, stopped in his tracks the moment he saw the cages. His skin turned pale, and his chest tightened as if he had seen a nightmare from the old legends come alive. He stepped closer, staring at the humans with wide, trembling eyes. His fellow guards laughed at his expression, mocking him for looking so afraid of children. But he knew better. He had heard the whispers passed down through his people's elders, stories told in hushed tones about humanity. They were not like the other species scattered across the stars. Humans came from a death world, a planet where survival was cruel, and the will to protect bloodlines was carved into their very bones. He had heard that when humans felt their children were threatened, their rage could shake entire empires. His hands trembled as he leaned closer to the bars, whispering words so soft the others almost didn't hear. "Do you even know what you've done?" His voice was weak, but the meaning was strong enough to freeze the air. The other guards exchanged confused glances, laughing nervously, as if his fear was madness, but deep in their stomachs a chill began to spread. The children huddled together, their small forms fragile yet their eyes shining with something unbroken. Even in fear, their spirits did not bend, and that made the officer shiver even more. He remembered tales of how human children were taught resilience before they could even speak, how their kind would crawl through fire just to survive, and he knew that if these young ones had been stolen, the adults who raised them would not rest. Somewhere far across the stars, Earth would learn about this prison, and when that moment came, no wall, no army, and no council decree would be able to hold back the storm. He turned away quickly, gripping his weapon tighter, though he knew it would be useless if what he feared came true. In the shadows of the prison, the silence began to grow heavy. The usual chatter of the guards quieted as if some unseen hand pressed against their throats. They tried to distract themselves, speaking of politics, of victories, of how capturing human children might be used as leverage in future wars. Some said the council would pay great rewards, others claimed humanity would beg for peace, but the older officers' warning words kept echoing in their ears. "Do you even know what you've done?" It became a whisper that bounced from one wall to the next, refusing to leave their minds. One of the younger guards scoffed, banging his fist against the bars to frighten the children, but the children only stared at him with cold, wide eyes. That gaze unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. For the first time, he realized there was something different about them. They were small, but they carried an invisible weight, as though the fire of their people burned quietly inside. He turned away quickly, pretending not to care, but a drop of sweat slid down his skin. The prison, which once felt like a place of strength, now felt like a ticking clock. Outside the prison walls, the stars stretched silent and infinite, but they were not blind. Somewhere out there, signals would leak, rumors would travel, and soon enough the humans would know. The old officer knew that the galaxy was not ready for what would follow. He imagined massive human fleets rising from the void, ships sharper than blades, moving with speed and silence. He imagined human soldiers marching with unshakable will, tearing through defenses as if they were nothing. The thought made his heart pound so hard he felt it in his ears. He wanted to shout, to warn his people, but no one would listen. They thought humanity was just another species. They thought children were a weakness to exploit. The children themselves sat closer together, whispering names of their parents, humming songs that reminded them of home. Their voices carried through the cold halls like fragile strings of hope. The older officer felt his chest ache, because he realized those sounds would travel across the galaxy like an alarm bell. Somewhere, human parents would hear their children cry, and when they did, the galaxy would burn. The officer whispered again, his words almost drowned by the silence. "You have doomed us all." The guards looked at him with irritation, but none dared to laugh anymore. Something about the room had shifted, something unseen yet undeniable. The silence was heavier than chains, heavier than walls, heavier than the prison itself. It wrapped around them like a curse, a reminder that the universe had laws far older than their arrogance. Laws written in blood and survival. And among those laws was one rule every elder knew: never harm the children of a Deathworlder. The prison lights flickered once, dimming as if the stars themselves were warning them. The children sat quietly, but their presence was enough to make even the strongest guard feel smaller than he had ever felt before. The officer backed away slowly, his face pale, his words trembling as he repeated, "Do you even know what you've done?" And in that moment, even without warships in the sky or armies on the march, the galaxy had already begun to shake. The whispers about the prison did not stay hidden for long, for nothing of such weight could ever remain buried in silence. A message slipped through the cracks of secrecy, carried on coded signals and hushed transmissions, until it reached the outer edges of human space. At first, the humans who received it refused to believe what they read. The words seemed too cruel, too impossible to be true. Human children, locked in alien cages, treated like bargaining chips. The thought alone was enough to freeze every breath in the command rooms of Earth's defense fleets. The officers who read the reports exchanged grim looks, and no one dared to speak for long moments. Silence stretched through the halls of power, thicker than stone, until one voice finally broke it with trembling anger: "Our children." That was all they had to say, for everyone else understood the meaning. Across Earth, across Mars, across every colony and station under the human banner, the news spread like wildfire. Families cried out in grief, soldiers clenched their fists in fury, and leaders stood in heavy silence, their eyes dark with storm. Humanity was not like the others in the galaxy, and the aliens had made a mistake too grave to measure. In the quiet chambers of the United Earth Council, no one raised their voices. There were no shouts, no angry speeches. Instead, there was stillness, a silence that grew heavier with every second. The council members understood that words were useless now. Humanity had always been patient, had always tolerated insults and threats when it came to politics or trade, but the line was drawn where bloodlines were touched. To harm the children was to declare war without ever saying it aloud. Old veterans who had fought in forgotten wars sat with their jaws tight, remembering the lessons carved into their past. Humanity did not forgive such crimes. One counselor finally whispered, "They have no idea what they have done." Those words rippled through the chamber, echoing the very warning spoken by the alien officer who had stared at the cages in dread. The first preparations began in silence. Fleets were recalled from the far borders. Soldiers were placed on high alert. Scientists worked without pause, upgrading weapons that had been shelved in fear of frightening the galaxy too much. Factories came alive with fire and steel, producing war machines with an efficiency that spoke of ancient survival instinct. The galaxy often joked that humans were dangerous because they came from a death world, but few truly understood what that meant. Now, they were about to learn. Meanwhile, in the distant halls of the Galactic Council, the news also arrived, though cloaked in layers of arrogance. Alien representatives dismissed it as a minor matter. Children are only tools, some said. The humans will bark, but they will not bite, others added. A few, however, remembered the old stories. A reptilian elder with scales faded by age shook his head slowly and hissed, "You fools. Do you not understand? When their children cry, humanity does not rest until the stars themselves bleed." His warning was met with laughter by the younger delegates, but those who listened closely noticed that his eyes trembled with true fear. He had lived long enough to witness things others had only heard in myths. Back on Earth, the silence did not mean inaction. It was the silence of a coiled predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Families wept, but their grief hardened into something unshakable. Soldiers sharpened their blades and prepared their ships, knowing the mission was no longer just duty but survival itself. Leaders moved with quiet resolve, for they knew they did not need to shout their intentions. The galaxy would hear soon enough, not in words but in fire. Among the stars, rumors began to spread. Merchant ships whispered of human fleets vanishing from trade routes. Scouts reported strange signals from the void, too fast and too precise to track. Entire sectors of space fell eerily quiet as human presence disappeared, replaced only by silence. The aliens laughed at first, thinking it was fear. But those who knew better grew pale. Silence was not weakness, it was warning. When humans did not answer, it meant they were preparing something unseen, something unstoppable. The children in the alien prison still clung to hope, whispering songs and names of their families. Each small voice was like a beacon calling out into the void. Though they did not know it, their cries were already stirring an empire of Deathworlders into motion. The older alien officer who had first spoken his warning now walked the halls with shaking hands. He tried to speak again, tried to tell his superiors to release the children, but they mocked him. "You worry too much," they said. "Humans are only flesh and bone. They will bend." Yet, deep inside, the officer knew. He had seen the eyes of the children, and he had felt the silence that followed. It was not weakness. It was the shadow of thunder before the storm. And so the galaxy stood on the edge of something it could not yet see. In one corner, arrogant laughter echoed, believing humanity could be controlled. In another, quiet whispers trembled with fear, knowing humanity would not forgive. And at the heart of it all, in cold cages on a forgotten moon, human children waited. The silence around them was not empty. It was alive, heavy, and waiting to break. Somewhere, ships were already moving, soldiers were already sharpening their blades, and leaders were already whispering the promise that had been carved into every human heart since the dawn of time. No one takes our children and lives to boast of it. The stars above the prison twinkled, unaware, but they would soon witness fire. The galaxy had made its mistake, and the humans were preparing to answer. Not with words, not with pleas, but with a storm that would make every world remember the weight of silence. The aliens had imprisoned human children, and that single act had already sealed their fate. The countdown had begun, even if they could not yet hear the ticking. The signal that confirmed the capture of human children reached deeper into Earth's command centers, and when the generals and admirals read it, not a single one raised his voice. They sat in silence, their faces like stone, but their hearts burned with fire. Orders were written without speeches, transmitted without fanfare. Whole fleets were pulled back from patrol as if vanishing into shadow. Docks that had slept for years woke to life, their giant arms moving like restless beasts. Factories filled with smoke and steel sang again with the sound of war machines being born. Humanity had been patient, had been quiet through insults, threats, and countless debates in the Galactic Council. But now their children had been touched. And there was no force in the galaxy that could stand between humanity and the blood debt that had been written. In the homes of Earth, Mars, and the colonies spread across the void, news spread faster than light. Families clutched pictures of missing sons and daughters, their eyes red with grief but shining with unbroken resolve. Communities came together, holding vigils that were not of sorrow but of promise. They did not cry out for mercy, they did not beg the council for help. They knew the only answer would come from their own people. In every settlement, in every city, in every outpost, the same words began to spread, whispered at first, then spoken louder, then shouted like thunder, "Bring them home." Those words became a vow, repeated across billions of human lips, uniting them into a single voice of unshakable fury. The Galactic Council watched these movements with mixed reactions. Some laughed, insisting humanity was dramatic, weak, too emotional to act with strength. They claimed humans were new to the stars, still learning, still fragile. They thought this fury was nothing but noise. But a few in the chamber grew pale as they studied the reports. They saw the silence, the precision, the way whole fleets vanished without leaving a trace. They remembered old stories told by ancient wanderers, tales of humanity's wars on their own death world, where they had destroyed themselves again and again but always risen stronger, sharper, more relentless. One elder whispered into the chamber's silence, "Do not mistake their tears for weakness. Those tears are the signal of fire to come." His words were dismissed, but the weight of them lingered. In the shadows of the galaxy, small things began to happen that went unnoticed by many but struck fear in those who understood. Alien pirate groups that had once preyed on human trade ships began disappearing. Their bases were found days later, burned to ash, their ships torn apart with surgical precision. No human fleet had been detected, no warning had been given. The strikes were silent, clean, and absolute. Whispers spread that humanity was already moving, already striking at those foolish enough to touch their blood. The silence was no longer just an absence of words. It was the sound of a predator stalking unseen, choosing the moment to strike hardest. Back in the prison on the barren moon, the children still clung together. Their fear had not broken them. They whispered their parents' names, sang songs of Earth, and spoke of home in voices soft but steady. Each word was like a spark, and though they did not know it, those sparks had reached across the void. The alien officer who had once whispered his warning now walked the halls with dread in his heart. He watched his fellow guards sneer at the children, watched them speak of using them as bargaining chips, and he knew every word they spoke was digging their own graves. He wanted to scream at them, to beg them to set the children free before it was too late, but he remained silent, because he knew the arrogance of his superiors would not bend. They thought humanity would beg. He knew humanity would burn. As Earth prepared, the void began to change. Navigation buoys went dark. Communication routes flickered and died. Alien traders complained of shadows moving through space, ships too fast to follow, too silent to track. The galaxy was restless, sensing something, but most ignored it. Only a few realized the truth. Humanity was moving, and when humanity moved for their children, it meant the end of balance. In secret chambers, human leaders met with commanders of their fleets. They did not draw up long speeches or declare great wars. Their words were simple, heavy, and clear. Bring them home. Make them pay. The commanders nodded, for they needed no further guidance. They knew what was at stake. The galaxy thought humanity was fragile, that they were still young. But the galaxy had never seen a species rise from ashes so many times, never seen a species carve survival out of poison winds, burning skies, and oceans that drowned without mercy. The galaxy had never seen the wrath of humans protecting their young. And so the countdown continued, though no clock was visible. The prison moon still floated in silence, holding its stolen children, unaware that its very existence had already sealed the fate of those who dared to guard it. The guards still laughed, still spoke of rewards and power, but the older officer knew. Each laugh was another step toward their doom. Each day of silence was not safety but warning. Somewhere, out in the black, engines burned hotter, weapons were armed, and warships moved without a sound. Somewhere, human soldiers sharpened their blades and whispered promises to the children they had never met. Somewhere, the storm was building, and when it broke, the galaxy would never be the same again. Humanity's silence was no longer just silence. It was the roar of thunder waiting to strike. The Galactic Council chamber was filled with voices, each louder than the last, as alien leaders argued about what to do with the news that spread like poison across the stars. Some shouted that the humans were overreacting, that no species should be feared so much over the capture of a few children. Others demanded silence, their eyes darting nervously as they remembered fragments of legends too old to ignore. Stories had always circled in the Council's archives about humanity's strange nature, about how they had fought each other for centuries in wars so violent they had almost burned their world to ashes and still survived. Yet many in the chamber laughed at such tales, calling them exaggerations, myths carried by frightened traders. They are only human, one counselor sneered, his voice echoing proudly. They will bend if we show strength. Children are leverage, nothing more. His arrogance was met with murmurs of agreement, but beneath those murmurs was unease. At the far end of the chamber, an elder rose to speak. His species had lived longer than most, their memories reaching back thousands of years, and his eyes glowed with a shadow of fear. His voice was calm, but the weight of it silenced the room. You fools speak of leverage as if you know humanity, he said. But you do not know them at all. Do you understand what it means to take their young? Have you forgotten the warnings? They do not beg for their children. They do not pay for their children. They burn worlds for their children. If they are silent now, it is because the storm is already moving. His words fell heavy on the chamber, and though some shifted uneasily in their seats, others scoffed, unwilling to bend to fear. The divide grew like a crack through stone. One half of the council convinced humanity was bluffing, the other half shivering at the thought that they were not. While the chamber filled with arguments and pride, humanity moved in silence. Fleets left their docks, their movements hidden beneath shadows and cloaked by the void. Ships older than a generation were pulled from their resting places and reforged into weapons sharper than before. Human soldiers trained in silence, their footsteps echoing in halls where no outsiders could see. They said little, but every motion was precise, every glance filled with unshakable determination. The galaxy thought words mattered, but humans were teaching them that silence was louder than any speech. In the prison on the barren moon, the children were still locked in their cages. Some were weak from hunger, others too tired to cry anymore, but they held one another with the resilience that came from being born human. They whispered songs and stories of home, voices so small that no guard cared to listen, but those whispers were heavy with unbroken spirit. The older alien officer who had first spoken his warning felt his dread deepen every time he heard those whispers. He saw in those children the fire that the galaxy had ignored. Each tear was not weakness, it was a signal, a call across the stars that humanity would answer. He tried again to warn his superiors, begging them to let the children go before it was too late. But his pleas were met with mockery. "You fear too much," his captain barked. "Humans are flesh and blood like the rest of us. Their threats mean nothing. When they see our strength, they will yield." The officer lowered his head, saying nothing more, but in his heart he knew. The humans would not yield. The aliens had chained a storm, and storms do not forgive. Whispers of fear began spreading outside the council chamber, carried by traders and spies who had seen strange movements in human space. Navigation beacons flickered out, leaving whole sectors of space silent. Scout ships sent to investigate never returned. Some alien merchants swore they saw shadows of massive ships gliding silently through the void, ships larger than anything the council had ever built. Most dismissed these stories as lies, but the few who listened felt their skin crawl. The silence was spreading, and it was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of preparation. Back on Earth, the leaders did not debate or argue as the aliens did. Their path was already chosen. In a quiet chamber, one commander stood before the Council of Earth, his voice steady, his eyes burning. "They took our children," he said simply. "That is all we need to know." No one asked for strategy. No one asked for mercy. The silence that followed was their agreement, and that silence carried across every fleet, every soldier, every world. It was the vow of humanity, unspoken yet absolute. The council's divide grew wider as reports continued to pour in. Some begged to release the children before it was too late. Others demanded to hold them tighter, to use them as shields against humanity's wrath. In their arrogance, they failed to see the truth. The choice was already gone. The moment the cages closed on human children, the war had been decided. Humanity would not stop. They would not forgive. They would not bargain. The storm had been set in motion, and it was only a matter of when, not if, it would arrive. The prison moon drifted silently in space, unaware that every second of its existence was counting down. The guards still mocked the children, still spoke of their power, still laughed at the warnings of their comrade. But the officer who had whispered his fear could no longer shake the image of what was coming. In his mind, he saw human fleets emerging from the void like shadows turned to fire. He saw their weapons tearing through walls and shields as if they were paper. He saw his people burning for a mistake too great to ever be undone. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "The silence will break soon." And across the galaxy, in places where the light of stars could not reach, humanity was already moving. Their silence was not weakness. Their silence was the sound of thunder rolling just beyond the horizon. The galaxy argued, laughed, and doubted, but the humans were already coming. And when they came, no council, no army, and no prison would stand at the darkness of the void. shadows began to move. The galaxy had not yet declared war, but war was already breathing. Alien traders who traveled near the edges of human space spoke of strange sightings, great shapes drifting without sound, larger than anything they had seen before. At first, no one believed them. They said their eyes were tricked by nebula storms or shadows of asteroids. But when entire trade convoys vanished without a single distress call, whispers began to spread. Something was happening. Something vast, silent, and unstoppable. The humans had gone quiet, and that silence was the most terrifying weapon of all. On distant colonies, human factories roared day and night. Their skies glowed red from the fire of forges. Their seas shook with the launch of massive ships. Workers did not complain. Soldiers did not hesitate. They all knew what was at stake. This was no ordinary call to arms. This was not about territory or wealth. This was about their children. And when humanity fought for its young, there was no limit to how far they would go. Every hammer strike, every engine test, every whispered command carried the weight of that truth. The galaxy thought humanity was still young. They thought humans could be broken with threats and power. But the galaxy had never seen the full fury of Deathwelders unleashed in silence. In the Galactic Council, reports piled higher each day. Navigation beacons near human space were going dark. Scout fleets sent to investigate were never heard from again. Some claimed that humans had built weapons too advanced for the Council to imagine, weapons that left nothing behind. Others argued these were lies, tricks to frighten them. But a quiet dread was spreading. The same words were whispered in every chamber, in every meeting: the humans are preparing. Those who feared begged for the release of the children, but arrogance still held the strongest voices. They said, if humans cared so much, they would have come already. Their silence means they are afraid. Those words were lies they told themselves, lies to hide from the truth, but the truth was already moving closer with every heartbeat. On the prison moon, the children felt the weight of time dragging slower each day. They were tired, hungry, and frightened, but their spirits did not break. They held each other, whispering stories of Earth and Mars, reminding themselves of home. Their songs carried through the metal halls, soft but steady. The guards laughed at them, mocking their fragile voices, but the older alien officer felt those whispers crawl under his skin. He knew what they meant. Each word, each cry, each song was like a flare shooting across the galaxy. It would reach their parents. It would reach their people. And when it did, the galaxy would know what it had done. He begged again for mercy, begged his superiors to let them go, but his words fell like stones into a void. The leaders of the prison dismissed him, calling him weak, calling him a coward. He lowered his head, but in his heart he whispered, when the silence breaks, none of us will survive. Strange signs appeared on the edges of alien territories. Entire mining stations were found deserted, their systems fried, their walls marked with burns from weapons unknown. No bodies were found, no survivors left to speak. The only evidence was silence. Fleets searching for answers sent messages back to their homeworlds, but midway through their reports, the signals cut off and never returned. Fear spread in every corner of the galaxy, though pride kept leaders from admitting it. Merchants stopped flying near human borders. Travelers changed their routes. And yet, the Council continued to argue. Some demanded the children be used as bargaining chips, others demanded war before humanity struck first. But those who had listened to the silence knew the war had already begun. On Earth, human families wept but did not break. They built shrines for their missing children, lighting candles that flickered against the dark. But those flames were not symbols of surrender. They were promises. Every tear shed was not a sign of weakness, but fuel for the fire that was already spreading. Mothers and fathers whispered to the stars, promising their children they would come. Soldiers heard those whispers and sharpened their blades. Admirals heard them and set their fleets into motion. Leaders heard them and tightened their silence. Humanity did not need to speak. Their silence was a vow. The galaxy began to notice the shadows of war in the smallest of ways. Patrol routes near human borders changed, yet no one saw them move. Weapons caches disappeared from neutral zones, yet no one saw who had taken them. And then there were the whispers of ghost fleets, hundreds of human warships moving as one, their engines dark, their weapons glowing faintly like eyes in the void. No one had seen them up close. No one lived long enough to tell. But the rumors grew stronger, and with them, fear grew sharper. The prison moon remained still, but the guards began to feel uneasy. The air seemed heavier, the silence thicker. Even the children's voices seemed to carry a weight they could not explain. The older officer walked its halls at night, unable to sleep, his mind filled with images of fire raining from the sky. He could feel it, as though the storm was already gathering above them, waiting only for the order to fall. He whispered to himself, "They are coming. Nothing can stop them now." And though no one heard him, the words were true. In every corner of the galaxy, the shadows grew. Humanity was no longer asking, no longer waiting, no longer begging. They were moving. The galaxy had touched their children, and in doing so, had touched the fire at the heart of their soul. The silence was almost over, and when it broke, the stars themselves would tremble. The galaxy did not see it coming. For weeks there had been rumors, whispers, and strange disappearances, but no one was prepared for the moment the silence finally broke. It began in the shadows of deep space, near the barren moon that held the cages. The guards had grown lazy, convinced their prison was safe, convinced humanity was still too far away to matter. The children sat quietly in their cages, their voices low, their bodies tired, but their spirits still unbroken. Then, in the dead of night, the moon trembled. At first it was small, like a distant quake, but then the ground shuddered so violently that alarms screamed across the complex. Guards ran in panic, weapons raised, but the older officer froze in place. He knew. His blood turned cold as he whispered, "They've come." In the black void outside the moon, human warships emerged from the darkness like predators slipping from the shadows. Their engines were silent, their movements sharp and perfect. No warnings were given, no threats shouted, no speeches delivered. They simply struck. A blinding flash of light tore through the prison's outer defenses, ripping apart entire towers in seconds. Alien guards screamed as their weapons failed, their ships were crushed, and their walls fell like paper before fire. The moon, once proud with its defenses, now shook under the fury of Deathwelder steel. Humanity had arrived, and they wasted no time. Inside the prison, explosions shook the walls. The children huddled together, covering their ears as the noise grew louder and closer. For a moment they feared it was the aliens trying to kill them, but then they saw it. Human soldiers bursting through the walls with weapons glowing, their armor scarred with the marks of countless battles. They moved like shadows of vengeance, precise and unstoppable. Without a word, they tore open the cages, lifting the children into their arms. The smallest of them cried in relief, clinging tightly to the soldier's armor. The oldest whispered, "You came," their voice trembling between tears and joy. The soldiers gave no long answers. One only said, "Always," before turning to fight the next enemy in their path. The alien guards tried to resist, but their weapons were useless. Human soldiers cut through them with terrifying speed. Each strike was silent, efficient, merciless. This was not war. This was a rescue wrapped in vengeance. The older alien officer who had once warned of this moment dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. His comrades called him a coward, but he knew better. He had told them this day would come, and now he watched it unfold with his own eyes. As the human soldiers stormed past, he whispered, "We should have listened." Above the prison moon, the real terror unfolded. Human warships encircled the orbit like wolves surrounding prey. Alien fleets scrambled to respond, sending reinforcements, but every ship that entered the system was met with fire. Humanity's ships were not the largest in the galaxy, nor the most advanced, but they were relentless. Their tactics were precise, their strikes overwhelming. Entire alien fleets were reduced to wreckage in minutes, their screams lost in the silence of space. The galaxy had always laughed at human warships, calling them crude, calling them brutal. Now those same ships moved with a grace that froze every commander who dared to watch. This was no crude fury. This was perfected vengeance. When the last of the cages were broken, the human soldiers began to pull back. The children were carried into armored transports, their tears falling against the cold plates of steel, but their eyes shining with hope. As the last group was lifted, alarms wailed louder, signaling the collapse of the moon's power core. The humans had planted charges, not to frighten, but to erase this place forever. One of the soldiers looked at the officer who had surrendered. For a moment, their eyes met. The soldier did not speak, but the meaning was clear. This is your punishment. Seconds later, the humans boarded their ships and vanished into the void. The moon erupted in flames, breaking apart like shattered glass, its prison erased from existence. The galaxy shook when the news spread. The prison was gone. The children were back on Earth, safe in their parents' arms, their voices crying with relief. The alien fleets sent to protect the prison had been destroyed so quickly that no one understood what had happened. Some said the humans had used forbidden weapons. Others said they had summoned monsters from their death world. But the truth was simpler. It was humanity itself, unleashed in silence, striking with fury that no one could stop. In the council chambers, silence reigned. Those who had laughed before now sat pale, trembling as the reports filled their hands. The elders who had warned them lowered their heads, whispering, "It has begun." Some tried to argue, demanding retaliation, but their voices were hollow. The galaxy now knew the truth. Humanity did not negotiate when it came to their young. They did not bargain. They did not beg. They destroyed. The older alien officer who had survived the prison sat alone in a refugee ship, his eyes haunted. He told anyone who would listen what he had seen. Their silence, their precision, their fury. "We thought them weak," he whispered again and again. "But they are storms. And when you cage their children, you invite the storm to your home." Few believed him fully, but those who did trembled with fear. On Earth, the children were reunited with their families. Mothers wept, fathers held their sons and daughters tightly, refusing to let go. Across the colonies, cheers rose, but beneath the joy there was something else, something darker. Humanity was not done. The children were safe, but the insult remained. The galaxy had dared to touch what was most sacred. And for that, there would be a reckoning. The silence had broken at last, and the galaxy finally understood what it meant. Humanity's fury was not a roar, not a scream. It was a storm that struck without warning, a fire that consumed everything in its path. And now, with their children safe, that fire turned outward. The galaxy had made a mistake too great to undo, and every star would soon learn the cost of their arrogance. The galaxy had not yet recovered from the destruction of the prison moon when a greater terror began to unfold. Alien leaders sat in their palaces, their voices sharp with anger but heavy with fear. They told their people the humans had struck like cowards, that the attack was a desperate act of revenge. They tried to hide their trembling hands as they spoke of retaliation, but deep inside they knew the truth. Humanity had not yet even begun. The prison was only the first blow, a warning carved in fire. What came next would decide the fate of entire worlds. In the cold black of space, human warships moved like shadows. They did not roar their presence with endless fleets marching openly across the stars. Instead, they appeared in silence, one system after another, their massive forms sliding from the void without a whisper. No sensors detected them until it was too late. No alarms sounded before their arrival. They simply appeared above alien capitals, black hulls gleaming with the scars of countless battles, their weapons glowing faintly in the dark. Whole populations looked to the sky and froze in terror as the silhouettes of human warships blocked the suns above their worlds. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. On one alien capital, the ruling council rushed to their defense stations, activating shields and calling their fleets. But before their ships could even move into formation, the human vessels fired a single warning shot. One city outside the capital vanished in an instant, reduced to ash and smoke that drifted across the wind. The message was clear: resistance would not be tolerated. Panic swept through the streets as citizens screamed, but the humans did not fire again. They simply hovered in silence, their presence suffocating, their silence screaming louder than words. Across dozens of systems, the same sight repeated. Human warships surrounding capitals, their guns aimed, their engines silent. They made no demands for territory, no cries for wealth, no speeches for glory. They spoke only a single sentence, delivered by cold transmissions that echoed in every language: "Never touch our children again." The words were not shouted, not dramatized, but they carried the weight of a billion voices. Every leader who heard them felt their blood freeze. It was not a threat. It was a law written in fire. In the Galactic Council, chaos erupted. Delegates shouted, some demanding war, others begging for peace. The hall that had once been filled with arrogance now reeked of fear. The oldest among them, who had warned from the beginning, stood and raised his voice above the storm. "You still do not understand. This is not war. This is judgment. They do not care for your fleets or your cities. They only care for what was taken from them. And now they have shown us their promise. They will destroy anyone who dares touch what is theirs." His words silenced the chamber, for none could deny the truth anymore. The galaxy had thought humanity weak. Now, they saw the truth with their own eyes. On Earth, the children who had been rescued were held tightly by their families. Their tears soaked into the uniforms of the soldiers who had brought them home. Parents whispered promises of safety, though their voices trembled with both love and fury. Across the colonies, humanity's unity had never been stronger. Their silence was no longer preparation. It was victory. Yet their leaders knew this was not the end. The children were safe, but the insult was carved deep into humanity's soul. Trust had been broken, and that wound could not be healed by rescue alone. The galaxy needed to understand, once and for all, that humanity's young were untouchable. The alien officer who had once warned his comrades now sat in the ruins of his escape pod, watching the sky as human ships passed overhead. He had survived when so many of his kind had not, but survival felt more like a curse than a blessing. He whispered to himself, "They do not roar. They do not beg. They do not shout. They arrive, they strike, they leave nothing but silence." His words carried through the refugee camps, and soon even those who had once mocked him began to repeat them. The legend of humanity's silence spread faster than fire. One by one, alien rulers who had been proud now bowed their heads. They sent messages to the humans, offering apologies, offering reparations, offering anything to be spared. But humanity did not respond with treaties or negotiations. They responded only with presence, the silent shadow of their fleets hovering above alien worlds, weapons primed but unmoving, eyes of steel watching. The meaning was clear. This was not a discussion. This was a warning carved into the stars themselves. Across the galaxy, children of every species were held closer by their families. Parents whispered prayers to their gods, hoping that none would ever make the same mistake again. Even species who had once laughed at humanity now understood. To harm human children was to invite the storm. And the storm did not roar. It struck in silence. The warships began to withdraw one by one, fading back into the void as quietly as they had arrived. But their absence did not bring comfort. Their silence was heavier than their presence, for every leader now knew the truth. Humanity could return at any moment, without warning, without mercy. They had made their promise, and the galaxy would never forget it. The galaxy would never be the same. After the silence of the fleets, after the burning of the prison moon, after the simple sentence that echoed across 1,000 worlds, "Never touch our children again," everything had changed. Alien leaders who once stood tall with pride now moved carefully, their voices cautious, their decisions heavy with fear. In their council chambers, they spoke in hushed tones, not daring to even say the words human children aloud, for even whispers carried weight now. The law had been written, not in ink, but in fire. Humanity had carved it into the stars, and no one could erase it. On worlds across the galaxy, alien parents pulled their own young closer, as if humanity's fury had taught them something even their own history had not. They realized that children, no matter the species, were not bargaining chips, not tools of power, but the most sacred bond any race could hold. The humans had forced that lesson upon them with silence, with precision, with vengeance so exact it could never be forgotten. Every parent who had seen human ships hover above their skies now understood. The humans were not weak. They were storms wrapped in skin, carrying love so fierce it could shatter empires. On Earth, the children who had been rescued were celebrated as symbols of survival. They were not just children anymore. They were proof that humanity would cross the stars and tear down the walls of any empire to bring their young home. Families wept as they embraced their sons and daughters, but those tears were not of sorrow. They were tears of pride, of relief, of fury turned into strength. Across the colonies, lights burned in windows as communities gathered to honor the soldiers who had brought them back. The silence that had once frightened the galaxy now became a comfort to the humans themselves. It was their shield, their promise, their unspoken vow to one another. We protect our own. But outside of Earth, silence meant something else. Alien fleets patrolled their borders with shaking hands, their commanders watching the stars with dread. They no longer asked if humanity would come. They asked when. Rumors of ghost fleets still spread. Stories of human ships seen on the edge of systems. Ships that vanished before scanners could confirm. No one knew if the sightings were true, but that uncertainty was worse than proof. It kept whole empires awake at night, wondering if the humans were watching, waiting, judging. The alien officer who had once whispered warnings to his comrades lived on in exile. He told his story to anyone who would listen, describing the cages, the silence, and the storm that had come. At first many mocked him, but over time, as more evidence of humanity's wrath reached the galaxy, his words turned into prophecy. He became a wanderer, moving from world to world, repeating the same truth: you cannot cage their children. You cannot even dream of it. To try is to end yourself. His words spread like fire in dry fields, until even those who had never seen a human whispered them in fear. The Galactic Council, once so arrogant, became quiet. The chambers where leaders shouted over one another now sat in heavy silence. When humanity's name was spoken, voices dropped to whispers. Resolutions were passed declaring children of all species untouchable by law. Some claimed it was an act of morality, but everyone knew the truth: it was an act of survival. The Council understood now that humanity's fury was not just for their own children but for the very idea of innocence itself. To harm a child was to invite the end, and no empire was bold enough to test that law again. And yet, there were whispers of respect buried within the fear. For the first time, the galaxy saw humanity not as reckless deathworlders, not as fragile newcomers, but as something far greater. They saw them as guardians of what was pure, protectors of what was sacred. Species that had once mocked humanity now spoke of them with a strange mixture of fear and reverence. Children in alien schools grew up hearing the story of the prison moon, the rescue, and the silent fleets that followed. And they learned the lesson carved into history: never harm the young of deathworlders, for deathworlders will burn the stars before they let them go. On Earth, life slowly returned to normal, though the scars would never fade. The rescued children grew older, carrying the memory of their cages but also the memory of the soldiers who came for them. They told their stories to younger generations, and those stories became legend. They spoke not only of fear and suffering but of hope, of strength, of the unbreakable bond of humanity. Their words became part of Earth's identity, shaping the next era of explorers, soldiers, and leaders. Humanity had always been underestimated, but never again. The fleets that had carried out the rescue did not boast of their victory. They returned to silence, their warships vanishing into the void, unseen and unheard. But everyone knew they were still out there, waiting, watching. Humanity did not need to remain in every sky. Their absence was enough, because the galaxy remembered what their presence had meant. Entire cities burned in seconds, fleets destroyed without warning, laws rewritten without negotiation. Silence had become their weapon, and silence remained their shadow. And so the galaxy lived under a new truth. They could fight over land, they could argue over trade, they could clash over politics. But there was one line no one dared to cross again. To touch the children of humanity was to invite the storm. And the storm was not loud. It did not roar with threats or promises. It came in silence, and it left only fire behind. Generations later, when young aliens asked why their parents held them so tightly, the answer was always the same. Because we learned from the humans. And in the deepest corners of space, when someone whispered humanity's name, it was no longer with laughter. It was with respect. It was with fear. And above all, it was with the memory of the silence that shook the galaxy forever.